The incident took place in 1907 or 1908. The person involved in the incident was named Motaleb. Motaleb's grandfather was a Kabiraj, and his name was Bundimia. This Bundimia used to perform his work with the help of 16 spirits. Motaleb was very brave, so he insisted on learning how to summon the leader of the 16 spirits. Bundimia refused and said, "You are not old enough. You cannot be taught this. You will be scared." But Motaleb was adamant and wouldn't listen. So Bundimia had no choice but to talk to Motaleb's father and say, "Your son is insisting on learning how to summon the leader of the 16 spirits. What do you say?" Motaleb's father said, "My son is very brave. He wants to learn, so teach him. You already practice this work, so teach him everything. He will be able to earn a living from this." His grandfather said, "Since you have given permission, I will teach him." Then his grandfather called Motaleb and said, "So you want to learn? You must not be afraid, but if you get scared, you will die." Motaleb replied, "Why should I be afraid? Teach me." His grandfather said, "This cannot be taught in one day. It will take 7 days. Motaleb said, "All right, that's fine." On the first day, his grandfather called Motaleb and told him to be ready that night as he would teach him a little. Motaleb worked all day and then went to his grandfather saying, "What will you teach me? Teach me." His grandfather taught him a prayer and said, "Go to the abandoned land near Moina's house, recite this prayer, and draw a circular boundary. Sit inside the circle on a prayer mat, hold a tasbih, prayer beads, and keep reciting the prayer. No matter what happens, do not be afraid." Following his grandfather's instructions, Motaleb went there at 1 a.m., performed the tasks as instructed, and after a while, he saw many ants roaming around the circle. Eventually, they disappeared. When the Fajr prayer call was heard, Motaleb returned home. The next morning, his grandfather asked, "What did you see last night, my grandson?" Motaleb said, "Countless ants and nothing else." His grandfather asked, "Were you scared?" Motaleb said, "Why would anyone be scared of ants?" On the second day, his grandfather called him again and said, "Tonight, you will go to the garden in the jungle." Just like the previous night, Motaleb went there and did everything as instructed. After a while, he saw countless snakes moving around the boundary just like the ants. Eventually, they disappeared. When the Fajr prayer call was heard, Motaleb returned home. On the third day, his grandfather asked him to sit again. That day, Motaleb saw many bears circling his boundary. On the fourth day, his grandfather told him to go to the abandoned land near the graveyard. When Motaleb went and sat there, he saw large elephants moving around. On the fifth day, his grandfather told him to go to Bashir Talukdar's jungle. When Motaleb sat there, he heard something approaching. As he opened his eyes, he saw large horses running toward him. The horses came near him and circled around. On the sixth day, his grandfather told him to go to Kalabari. As usual, Motaleb drew a boundary, laid down his prayer mat, held his tasbih, and sat inside. But that night was different. He saw the ground around him breaking apart and turning into a river. If it broke once more, he would fall into the river. Just then, the Fajr prayer call was heard, and he quickly went home. The next morning, his grandfather asked, "What happened last night?" Motaleb said, "The ground around me was breaking, and a river was forming. If it had broken once more, I would have fallen in." His grandfather asked, "Were you scared?" Motaleb said, "I wasn't scared, but it wasn't something to not be afraid of." His grandfather said, "That was nothing. Tomorrow, the leader of the spirits will appear before you. Do not look away. Watch what he does." On the seventh went to Fakir Bari jungle at 1 a.m. He drew a boundary, placed his prayer mat, held his tasbih, and sat inside. After a while, he saw a palanquin carried by 4 men approaching him. It stopped right in front of him. A harsh voice from inside the palanquin scolded, "Hey, you fool! Why do you keep calling me every day?" Motaleb replied, "I called you because I want to learn mastery." The voice inside the palanquin said, You want to learn math?" said, "Yes." There was silence for a moment. Then suddenly, a loud roar shook the entire jungle. Motaleb was startled. The voice inside the palanquin angrily said, "You can't even endure my roar, yet you want to learn mastery?" Saying this, it delivered a slap so powerful that Motaleb's left cheek was pressed against his right cheek. Motaleb lost consciousness. The next morning, his grandfather came and asked Motaleb's father, "Where is Motaleb?" Motalib's father said, "He hasn't come home yet." His grandfather said, "Then we must go to Fakir Bari jungle and bring him back." Later, a group of people went there and found Motalib lying unconscious. They brought him home. When he regained consciousness, they asked him what had happened. Slowly, Motalib began to explain what had occurred that night. After hearing everything, his grandfather said, "There is nothing more I can do. Your son will only live for 7 more days." And just as his grandfather had predicted, Motalib died 7 days later. Heartbroken over the loss of his grandson, the grandfather trapped the leader of the 16 spirits inside a gab tree by the village road. He warned the villagers, "Be careful when walking here on Saturdays and Tuesdays. The leader of 16 spirits is imprisoned here." The villagers didn't believe him. One of them said, "If there really is a leader of 16 spirits here, then show us and we will believe." The grandfather said, "You will see on the night of the new moon or the full moon." Then, on the night of the full moon, he took the villagers to the gab tree and said, "Leader of 16 spirits, show yourself. The villagers want to see you." The villagers then saw a massive figure standing with one foot on the gab tree and the other on a nearby tamarind tree. The figure had a turban on its head and held a staff in its hand. Among the villagers witnessing this, my great-grandfather was also present. Let's move on to the next incident. My name is Aisha, and my age is around 35 years. Today, I'm going to share a horrifying experience of my life with you all. Calling it just an experience would actually be wrong because this is a real incident from my life. This incident is inscribed in the pages of my life like a dark chapter. This event happened to me in 2014, and its consequences still persist today. You will understand why I said this once you hear the story. Since childhood, my marriage had been fixed with my own aunt's son. As I grew up, I reached the threshold of my educational life. Both my cousin, with whom my marriage was fixed, and I had been aware of our marriage since childhood. When we grew up, we started liking each other. But suddenly, my aunt moved to Canada with her entire family. Since childhood, I was not very interested in reading the Quran or praying. I don't know why. My parents used to scold me a lot about this, and they were often angry with me. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't focus on prayers or the Quran. My cousin's name was Feroz, with whom my marriage was fixed. Feroz also went to Canada with my aunt. Even after he left, we kept in touch. We used to talk for long hours on video calls every day. This went on for almost 2 years. Once my aunt and her family settled in Canada, my aunt told my mother that now it was time for Feroz and Ayesha's wedding. My aunt wanted to arrange a grand wedding in Bangladesh and later hold another grand ceremony in Canada. But as soon as our wedding was finalized, strange things started happening to me. I began noticing that almost every night I had strange and terrifying dreams. In those dreams, I would see my future husband, his family members, or even my own family members dead. These dreams were horrifying. Not only that, but in those dreams, I would find myself standing next to the dead bodies, laughing loudly. And in the dream, a voice kept repeating the same thing over and over again. "Don't get married. You will regret it later." Earlier, I used to have trouble praying or reading the Quran, but since the day my wedding was finalized, I couldn't even tolerate listening to the Quran or the call to prayer, azan. Whenever the azan would be called from the mosque near our house, I would try to move to another room so that the sound wouldn't reach my ears. Sometimes, I would even cover my ears with my fingers to block the sound. Additionally, when I saw my siblings or mother praying, an intense discomfort would arise within me. I would stare at them with extreme hatred. Seeing them in prayer made me unbearably angry. Nauzubillah. I would start arguing with them for no reason. My family members started noticing these changes in me. They thought that since my wedding was near and I had to leave home and move to another country, I was feeling anxious and unsettled. But I knew that my distress was not because of the wedding or leaving home. My condition worsened to the point where I was always angry at everyone. I would argue over small matters. Afterward, I would regret it, but at the moment, I wouldn't even realize I was doing something wrong. Sometimes, I would argue with my siblings and completely forget about it later. They would be shocked and say that just a while ago, I had treated them terribly, and now I was denying it. The truth was, I wouldn't even remember what I had said or done. The dreams continued as usual. Sometimes, for a day, I wouldn't see any dreams, but otherwise, almost every night, I would see the same horrifying scenes. In those dreams, I often saw strange, shackled women, children, and men with deformed faces. Sometimes they would drink the blood of dead animals, and at other times, they would feast on the flesh of dead humans with great satisfaction. Imagine how you would feel if you had to see such terrifying dreams every night. To make you understand the horror of those dreams, I have to say something that I probably shouldn't, but I must to convey how dreadful they were. These dreams were so terrifying that once or twice my bed even became impure. I sincerely apologize for saying this, but I had to express it to help you understand. As time passed, my wedding day came closer, and these dreams became more frequent. One day I told my mother about my strange predicament. I only told her about my dreams. I didn't mention my problems with the Azan or the Quran. Please remember this point. In our neighborhood, there was a woman who performed minor spiritual healing, Ruqya. My mother took me to her in the evening. The woman performed some practices to understand my condition. After checking, she said that it seemed like I was trapped in something, but it was not very dangerous. She said that such things often happen to unmarried girls. She gave my mother some blessed water and told her to get me married as soon as possible. She claimed that after marriage, everything would be fine on its own. But as the saying goes, a little knowledge is dangerous. Just as an unskilled doctor can put someone's life at risk, an incompetent religious healer can endanger someone's faith. That woman was unskilled. She told my mother to get me married quickly, but if my mother had known the real reason behind my condition, she wouldn't have hurried my wedding. She would have canceled it altogether. Because what we later discovered nearly destroyed my life. As the wedding day approached, our entire family gathered for the celebrations. We performed all the pre-wedding rituals, and there was a lot of joy and festivity. Just as my aunt had planned, the main wedding was scheduled to take place on a Friday, right after the Jummah, Friday prayers. But before the Jummah prayer, a disaster struck our house. My uncle, Firoz's father, and my would-be father-in-law passed away just before the Jummah prayer. A house filled with joy suddenly plunged into mourning. My mother was devastated by my uncle's sudden death, but more than that, she was terrified about what would happen to me. She feared that my aunt might cancel or postpone the wedding. She also worried that my aunt's family might start blaming me. We were all in shock. My uncle was only 50 years old, yet he was strong, fit, and completely healthy. The night before, he had participated in all the wedding festivities with great enthusiasm. No one could understand what had suddenly happened to him in the morning that caused his sudden death. The next day was my uncle's funeral. For the next 3 days, everyone was overwhelmed with grief, and no one spoke about the wedding. After 3 days, my aunt told my mother, "Let's hold a simple wedding for the children. Then once we return to Canada, we will organize a granting ceremony for Ayesha and Firoz." Hearing about the wedding from my aunt, my mother sighed in relief, and the wedding, which was supposed to be a grand affair, was completed in the presence of only a few people. After that, my aunt and Firoz left for Canada, and I kept waiting for Firoz. It took almost 3 to 4 months for my Canada visa to arrive. After receiving the visa, my family members went to the airport to see me off. Upon arriving in Canada, I saw that many of Firoz's family members had come to pick me up at the airport. But looking at their faces, it seemed they were still mourning my uncle's death. On the other hand, the respect and love that my aunt and Firoz gave me was something I had perhaps never even received from my own family. But after that, what happened started creating cracks in my relationship with my in-laws. Such incidents began occurring that made both of us irritated with each other. One night, we were both sleeping in our room when suddenly some noise woke us up. We both sat up in bed, startled, and saw that the TV in front of us had turned on by itself, playing a terrifying movie. A girl in the movie was screaming heartbreakingly, and that very scream had woken us up. We were both shocked, looking at each other. Then Firoz looked at my side table and saw the TV remote placed there. He said that maybe my hand had accidentally pressed the remote in my sleep, turning the TV on. After turning the TV off, we lay down again to sleep. Barely 2 minutes had passed when the TV turned on again. This time, Feroz got a little annoyed and asked for the remote. When I handed him the remote, he reset all the TV functions and turned it off again. But just a few seconds later, the TV somehow turned on by itself once more. Feroz told me that it seemed like the TV remote was broken and asked me to turn off the main switch of the TV. I got up, turned off the switch, unplugged the TV, and went back to bed. But what was meant to happen still happened. About 10 minutes later, the TV turned on again. This time, Feroz was quite irritated and said, "Didn't I tell you to unplug the TV from the socket? You couldn't even do that." But I clearly remembered unplugging it. I told him, "I did it right in front of you. I unplugged it from the socket." Hearing this, he pointed toward the plug and told me to look. The plug was still in the socket. He then asked me, "When did you unplug it?" I had no answer. I knew I had unplugged it, but how did it get back into the socket? I had no idea. I didn't argue with him anymore because I was still new at my in-laws' place and didn't want to create any issues. I quietly got up, called him over, and said, "Look, I'm unplugging it again right in front of you. Watch carefully." I unplugged it. Strangely, after that, the TV didn't turn on again, meaning the blame came directly onto me. Even though Feroz didn't say anything more about it, I still felt bad. That very week, my mother-in-law sent Feroz and me on a trip. We had a great time during those days, but even then, some incidents kept happening that made me look bad in front of my in-laws. Let me tell you about a few small incidents. For instance, Feroz would ask me to bring him water. I would place the water on the table as he asked. A little later, he would call me again for water. When I went to check, the water had disappeared. The glass was still on the table, but it was empty. At first, I thought maybe they were playing a prank on me. But Feroz was a straightforward and good man. I didn't think he would ever play such childish tricks on me. And from their behavior, it didn't seem like they were joking. Sometimes I would sit on the terrace at night and drink coffee. Feroz had a spare key to the house for when he returned from the office. Often, he would enter the room without me even realizing it. One night, I finished my coffee on the terrace and returned to my room. But when I got there, the door was locked from the inside. I knocked, thinking that maybe Feroz was changing his clothes. I was about to go to the kitchen to get him some coffee when I suddenly remembered that I had left a plate of food in the room. I decided to wait for him, but as I turned back, I saw that the door was open. Just then, I heard Feroz call me from behind, and I was so startled that I screamed in fear. I turned around and saw that he was coming from the kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand. Hearing my scream, he got so startled that the coffee cup fell from his hand. He looked at me with annoyance. Then suddenly, he started walking away as if in a daze. I ran after him. He walked out of the house and stood by the road. I went to check if he was okay, but he didn't say a word. After a while, he finally spoke. "What happened to you? I told you earlier that I was going to get coffee. You were lying on the bed, so why did you get so startled when I brought the coffee? Why did you scream so loudly? And who were you waiting for outside the door?" I was stunned, looking at his face. What was he saying? I didn't understand anything. He had locked the room from inside, so I never expected him to come from behind me. That's why I was scared when I heard his voice. But seeing the coffee in his hand, I thought maybe my aunt had made it for him. And I wasn't even in the room. I was on the terrace. So who did he see lying on the bed? Both of us went to my aunt and told her everything. She became worried, but tried to calm us down. "You two are probably overthinking. Don't dwell on this too much. Just go to your room and rest. If you need anything, call me. I'll bring it to you myself." We were still shocked, but went back to our room. Then came the next night. Around 3 a.m, I suddenly woke up. I got up and went to the washroom. My eyes were hurting for some reason. When I washed my face and looked into the mirror, I saw a girl standing behind me, someone who looked exactly like me. Just imagine, someone who looked exactly like me was standing behind me. How would you feel if this happened to you? I lost consciousness right there because I didn't have the strength to handle it. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I saw my aunt and Feroz standing beside me. They were asking me what had happened. I realized that I had fainted in the washroom. I tried to make sense of their words. Maybe I had slipped and fallen in the washroom, but I clearly remembered returning to my room before passing out. That's when I understood that what Feroz saw the other night, someone lying on the bed, wasn't a lie. I had seen her with my own eyes too. Everything kept happening like this. The house we lived in was a rented house. Coincidentally, the landlord's wife was Bangladeshi. They had been in Canada for a long time and owned multiple rental properties. The landlord and his wife were wonderful people. The landlord's wife often visited my aunt. One day, she came to our house and met me. She was very happy to see me because she and her husband didn't have any children. She said, "From today, I consider you my daughter." She blessed me and before leaving, placed a $500 note in my hand. I was extremely surprised because $500 was a lot of money at that time. I tried my best to refuse, but she said, "Does a daughter ever refuse her mother?" From that day on, I couldn't say anything else, and a very good relationship developed between us. A few days later, she came to our house again, and my aunt told her everything that had happened to us during those days. Hearing my aunt's words, she became very worried and said she would see if she could find a solution to the problem. One night, while my husband and I were sleeping, a cricket match was going on in the field behind our window. Suddenly, a sound woke me up. It felt like a girl was singing outside the window. I called my husband and said, "Listen, check if there's any noise outside." We both started listening attentively. The intensity of the sound gradually increased. It seemed like a young girl was humming joyfully. My husband had a habit. Whenever something like this happened, he would play surah on the TV. But as soon as he did that, I would start feeling restless and leave the room. Sometimes I blamed myself, wondering how a person could feel discomfort from the words of Allah. But brother, I used to feel immense pain, like someone was drilling into my body. That night too, my husband Feroz played the surah, and strangely within moments, the singing stopped. The next afternoon, she came again and told us that she had contacted a well-known peer spiritual leader. When she came to our house, she let me speak with him over the phone. The peer sahib told me, "Daughter, you made a huge mistake by getting married. Since birth, you have had an entire clan of jinn and evil spirits attached to you. I still can't understand why they are following you, but this is why you feel pain when you hear the Adhan and the Quran." At first, I thought maybe the peer was just making up stories to take money from us. But then he said, "You struggle to hear the Quran and the Adhan." And I started crying because I had never shared this with anyone, not even my own mother. How did the peer know? That's when I realized that my assumptions about him were completely wrong. I asked him, "What is the solution to this?" He said he would try but couldn't promise anything. If it were just 2 or 4 jinn, a person could endure the pain. But in your case, there are thousands of them, and controlling them is extremely difficult. He said he would try to find out why they were attached to me in the first place. I started crying, and my landlord's wife consoled me, saying, "Inshallah, there will be a way out." But I could feel that ever since my aunt and Feroz found out about the jinn, their attitude toward me had changed. They stopped talking to me properly. A few days later, the peer started my treatment again. Suddenly, things in our house took a turn for the worse. First, my aunt fell from the stairs while standing, and her knee broke. She claimed that someone had pushed her forcefully, causing her to fall. Then an incident happened that completely shattered our relationship. Feroz had a terrible accident. His friend was with him at the time. It was a horrific crash. Their entire car was destroyed. But by Allah's mercy, both of them survived. They had lost consciousness, but miraculously, neither suffered any major injuries. They were rushed to the hospital, and when Feroz regained consciousness, I noticed that he was completely broken. The car's steering wheel had injured his hand, and it wasn't in good condition. He started thinking that if he divorced me, maybe everything would return to normal. He already believed that he lost his father because of me. That was their assumption. Feroz blamed me for his father's death. After his accident, my aunt became silent. She called my mother and said, "Sister, take your daughter back. We don't want her in our lives anymore. I will send the divorce papers soon. We can't live with her anymore." While my aunt was on the phone with my mother, my landlord and his wife were standing behind her. When they heard everything, they took me to their house. My landlord and his wife consoled me and said, "Right now, they are all grieving. Stay with us for a few days. Inshallah, Allah will create a way out." The landlord's wife contacted the peer again. The peer said he was trying his best, but he didn't know if he could remove all the jinn from me because their numbers were too many. However, after speaking with them, he found out that these jinn would never allow me to get married. Not just this marriage, but they didn't want me to marry at all. The landlord's wife asked him, "Why? What is their problem with her marriage?" The peer said, "I don't know. I asked them this question, but they didn't answer. I'm only telling you what they have shared with me." He also said, "As long as she doesn't get married, she will be fine. Otherwise, she won't." The landlord and his wife told me to stay with them for a while longer. After a month, I told them that I wanted to return to Bangladesh. The landlord said, "Don't worry, I'll talk to Feroz myself and make him take you back." The landlord didn't believe in supernatural things. He thought there had been some misunderstanding between us, and that if he mediated, things would work out. The next day, he called Feroz to his office and said, "Feroz, take your wife back and act like a responsible man. It's not right to separate from your wife during difficult times." The landlord was an influential person in Canada, so Feroz couldn't refuse. Feroz told him that he would discuss it with his mother and let him know. But in trying to fix my marriage, the landlord suffered a huge loss. They had several cattle farms. The next day, their livestock started dying one by one for no reason. Almost every day, 2 or 3 cows would die. The landlord was devastated. He told his wife, "I don't understand what's happening. The animals are dying without any cause." They couldn't find any explanation for it. Then the landlord and his wife contacted the peer again. The peer himself told them, "Whoever helps in fixing her marriage will suffer a great loss." Eventually, my divorce happened. With the help of my landlord and his wife, I decided to stay in Canada permanently instead of returning to Bangladesh. Although they advised me against it, I rented my own apartment and started living independently. I did all kinds of jobs, working in supermarkets, restaurants, while also continuing my higher education. It has been 11 years since then. I am still in Canada and now work as a teacher at a local school. I never returned to Bangladesh. My relatives and siblings are busy with their own families, so I never thought about going back. The last time I went to Bangladesh was when my parents passed away. Now my only family is my landlord and his wife. Whenever I miss being with loved ones, I visit them. As for marriage, the fear within me grew so much that I never considered getting married again. This was my real-life story. Not every story in life finds closure. Some stories, like mine, remain unresolved forever. Let's move on to the next incident. My name is Saqib Ahmed. The time was the year 2018. I was in class 7 then. After finishing my annual exams, I went to visit my elder sister's house. The incident took place there on December 28th. My exam results were published, but since I was at my sister's house, I couldn't know my school results. So I called my class teacher, Hanan Sir, to know my results, but he didn't receive the call. Meanwhile, evening was approaching. It is worth mentioning that the network was very weak at my sister's place. So for better network coverage, I went outside behind my sister's house where there was a bamboo grove and a jackfruit orchard. Since Sir was not receiving my call, I called Atik Sir and told him that Hanan Sir was not picking up my call. I requested him to call Sir and inform me about my results. Atik Sir said, "All right, wait. I will find out and let you know." Later, I was hoping for Sir's call when suddenly someone hit me on the back of my neck. I turned around and saw no one. I was really scared, but just then Sir called and said, "You became second in class." In excitement, I ran to tell my sister. By then it was getting dark and my head felt very heavy. When I reached my sister, I saw her working on a sewing machine. I told her, "My results are out. My roll number is 2. My sister said, "That's great news, Russell. That's where the incident started. After dinner, when I was about to go to sleep, my brother-in-law asked, "Where will you sleep? With us or in the veranda room?" I said, "I will sleep in the veranda room." It is worth mentioning that for the past 2 days my brother-in-law was on day duty, so he would sleep at home at night. But when I came to visit, he was on night duty, so I used to sleep with my sister. My brother-in-law was a supervisor at Kadir Molla's Adari jute mills in Narsingdi. Since I was going to sleep alone in the veranda room, I asked my nephew Junaid, who was about 4 or 5 years old, "Will you sleep with your uncle tonight?" He replied, "No, I won't sleep with you." My brother said, "What's there to be afraid of? If you get scared, leave the door open and call me." So I had no choice but to sleep alone in the veranda room. Since it was late December, the nights were a bit chilly. I lowered the speed of the fan, kept it on, recited prayers, took a blanket, and lay down. At night, a loud noise suddenly woke me up. I was very startled and had no idea what the sound was. I gathered my courage and went outside. As soon as I stepped out, I saw my brother-in-law standing under the bell tree in the yard. I didn't think much of it and was about to return to my room when I asked, "Aziz Bhai, what are you doing under the bell tree so late at night?" No response. Everything around me felt eerily quiet, with only a faint buzzing sound in my ears, like the sound insects make at night. Was that figure really my brother-in-law, or was it something else? Later, I returned to my room. Since my brother-in-law had told me not to lock the door, I just pushed it shut and lay down. After a while, I started feeling sleepy, and then I heard a sound. Someone came and sat at my feet. Since my bed was made of steel, I could clearly sense someone's presence. A whispering voice was speaking, but I couldn't understand anything. I thought maybe my sister was trying to scare me as a prank. I asked, "Who are you, Janati Appa?" No response. After a while, the whispering stopped. I kept telling myself that my sister was just trying to scare me, and I wasn't going to be afraid. Then suddenly, something grabbed my foot tightly. I couldn't move my leg. I screamed loudly, "Appa, let go of my foot." Just then, my sister's voice came from her room. "Saqib, what happened?" Believe it or not, after hearing that, I was completely speechless. Despite the winter, I was sweating profusely, breathing heavily, and my heartbeat had increased. I didn't even have the strength to call out to my sister. I kept wondering, if my sister was in her room, then who was that? Then I screamed and called my brother-in-law. He immediately woke up, rushed to my room, and turned on the light. There was no one there. That night, I went to sleep in my father's room. The next morning, I told everyone about the incident. My brother-in-law, after hearing everything, said, "What? No, I wasn't outside at all. Why would I go out so late at night?" I came home from college, took a shower, had dinner, and went straight to bed. It is worth mentioning that my brother-in-law worked at Narsingdi Government College and usually came home around 7 p.m. Even today, when I recall that night, it gives me chills. I still have the same questions in my mind. Who was that figure that looked like my brother-in-law? Why didn't it harm me? And who was whispering to me in the room? These questions remain unanswered to me even now. Let's move on to the next incident. Rahat works in an organization. Their work takes place in different regions of Bangladesh, and this time, his posting was in a completely natural environment. There were very few established houses or settlements in that area. The organization had its own office compound, and beside it was a very old place, dating back to the British period. That place had been in use since then. Surrounding it were trees, vast potato fields, and people from nearby villages who cultivated potatoes. Beyond the potato fields, there was a dense jungle. During the day, Sifat's brother had his official work, but after sunset, there wasn't much to do. The office was located beyond the village, past fields and trees. There was nowhere to go and spend time after dusk, even in the village. So, after office hours, Rahat usually had nothing to do and stayed inside the office. The network signal for phone calls was not strong there. So, in the evenings, Rahat would go for walks around the office compound, sometimes walking farther. He would follow the narrow paths between the potato fields and walk quite a distance, eventually reaching the area with trees. While walking, he would talk on the phone, sit on a mud-built TV stand, browse social media where the network was slightly better, or try to watch something on YouTube, although streaming was not smooth. Eventually, he would fall asleep, and this was his daily routine. One day, something happened, something very recent. It was winter, and during this time, there were no storms. In that area, there was no sign of strong winds or storms. The place was surrounded by trees, and farther away, there were small hills and mountains. That night, Rahat stepped out of the office. The office compound had security guards stationed at different checkposts. Since it was their organization's premises, security was tight to prevent any nighttime crimes. Rahat noticed dim lights far away where the security posts were located. Since electricity could not be extended to such a distant post, they used chargeable lights and flashlights. It was a cold night with thick fog covering everything. The trees in the distant forest were barely visible through the mist, and some fog was drifting over the potato fields. Rahat was wearing a thick jacket to keep warm. After standing outside for a while, he noticed that dew was settling on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should go out for a walk in such cold weather. Eventually, he decided to go since he was bored of staying indoors. He took his phone and started walking while talking to a friend. He became so engrossed in the conversation that he unknowingly walked past the trees, following the narrow paths between the fields. At one point, the call started breaking up and the network failed entirely, causing the call to drop. That's when he realized how far he had walked. Looking ahead, he saw a wide open space, followed by another dense forest. Suddenly, he noticed that the fog had become much denser in that area. Then strong winds started blowing. The tops of the trees were swaying heavily, bending under the force of the wind. It seemed as if a small whirlwind was forming in that area, swirling around the trees. Rahat stepped back, feeling uneasy. He moved toward the trees and noticed that the wind was causing a significant disturbance among the branches. Suddenly, he heard a strange, rough howling sound, something like a dog's but more unnatural. He looked ahead into the open area and saw about 20 to 25 foxes standing there. Their eyes glowed like fire, staring at him. Some of the foxes were growling with a low, rumbling sound, while others let out sharp, eerie cries. They were inching closer to him. Rahat was terrified. He knew that if foxes attacked in groups, it could be very dangerous because they were carnivorous predators. Moreover, these foxes were larger than normal. He thought of two escape plans, either climbing a tree or running as fast as possible. At that moment, he noticed that the swirling windstorm was moving toward him. Sure. Here's the English translation of the text without changing anything. The foxes moved a little to the side as something came, and it looked at the trees that were swaying, and the foxes started making sounds. Some of them making a noise like kyak kyak, like the sound of a dog, but not exactly like a dog's sound. More like kyak 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 in a strange way. And 2 or 3 foxes were making a drawn-out sound, which Rahat had never heard before. Rahat was calling out, and he looked at the trees, where their eyes were glowing like fire. Rahat was so scared that he ran away from there, running frantically, and he felt like the foxes were chasing him. He was running so fast, faster than he had ever run before in his life, faster than in his school or college life, or any kind of sports event. He kept running, his feet pounding as he made his way across the potato field, stumbling and falling as the plants were crushed beneath him. But he didn't have time to look at the damage, as he quickly got up and kept running. After a while, he realized that the field he was crossing seemed to be getting lower, and the movement suggested the foxes were coming through. He was running as fast as he could, trying to reach the compound. He had never thought that he would be running like this in his life, not even in sports. Rahat was running and then saw that he had entered the compound. He was running toward the dormitory and could feel the urgency. When he reached the stairs, he felt like the foxes were getting closer to him, and with fear, he sprinted up the stairs and quickly entered his room. As he entered, a gust of wind passed close to his ear, a warm wind he had never felt before, and there was a whistling sound like the wind had whistled past his ear. He rushed into his room, locked the door behind him, and then heard the foxes' calls from outside. They were making strange sounds, and it terrified him. He switched on the light, but the generator seemed to have failed, and there was no electricity. Fearfully, Rahat went inside and found his flashlight in his pocket, the one he always carried when he went out. He turned it on and walked slowly toward the balcony. From the balcony, he looked out and saw the open area outside his house. There was a small path leading to a fence, and beyond that, fields began. He saw, near the fence, a pack of at least 20 to 25 foxes standing still, their heads raised and staring toward his house. They were calling out with an eerie tone. Rahat felt his soul leave him in fear, and he sat there for a long time. He then took out his phone and checked the network. He remembered the security guard's number and called him. When the guard answered, Rahat explained that he had been hearing foxes' calls. The guard said he could hear them too and mentioned that there was no electricity and that the fuel for the generator was finished. The guard said he couldn't come until morning. Rahat, realizing he couldn't do anything, decided to try to sleep in fear. As he tried to sleep, he could still hear the foxes calling in unusual ways. It sounded like a festival was happening outside, and he finally fell asleep from the overwhelming fear. The next morning, Rahat woke up quickly, remembering the events of the previous night. He got up, freshened up, and went downstairs, planning to go for breakfast. He asked the guard if anything unusual had happened. The guard said that he had also heard the fox's calls, and then explained something even more strange. The guard recalled a night when another security guard had gone out and walked toward the checkpoint. Far from the compound, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the field. At first, he thought it might be a thief. He shouted, flashed his light at it, and saw that the figure dissolved in the air like a blast of wind. The guard was terrified, and as he looked around, he saw the foxes emerging from the field, staring at him. In panic, he ran away, and the foxes chased him. The guard jumped up to the checkpoint, which was higher than the ground, and he climbed the stairs with such speed that he barely avoided the foxes. The stairs were like a ladder, so no animal could climb them. Unless it is a monkey of this species, it might be able to climb, but no other creature can climb it. He said that he jumped a few feet up and grabbed it, then quickly pulled himself up and slowly climbed up. He was watching as his partner, who was also on guard duty at night, was sleeping. After he climbed up, he went to check with the guard. When they went up, they saw that the foxes were completely surrounding them, growling at them, and they stayed like that until late in the night, howling with their heads raised. Both of them were very scared and wondered what was happening. Towards the end of the night, they noticed something moving very quickly through the bushes, breaking and tearing through the bushes. He told his partner, the guard, that he had seen something very strange. His partner said, "I've also seen strange things moving here. There's something bad, something up there. Don't mess with it." Anyway, the guard told Rahat about this event, and after hearing it, Rahat realized that something was very different about the situation. He had an experience with it. Since Rahat works in remote areas and has worked in many remote parts of Bangladesh, his organization often sends him to such places. However, he had experienced strange things like this many times before. If you would like to share with us an incident that happened to you or a true ghost story that you know of, please write or record the incident and send it to us by email. Our email address is ghostreadeye@gmail.com, GHOSTSREYE@gmail.com.